Because people who think by cheating they gain something in the short term forget that in the long term they have to pay a price for that. And they think they're clever because they get away with it in the short term. But right from the start Allah makes it clear that everything here is set in the frame of reference of the hereafter. Because to be sure about that is the key characteristic, or one of the key characteristics about those who are aware of Allah, the Muttaqim. Now in set against the frame of the long term all the way to the hereafter, that short term action of cheating doesn't benefit. In fact, they trading in what is of a lesser value for something that is of a higher value. So they're losing out rather than making a profit. They lose out on the guidance and ultimately lose out on the acceptance by Allah or the salvation, and instead get the error. That is, they lose their way, they go away from the right path. That imagery is there again, because what is error? Error is going astray. Yes, it's the same term that we have here. Dalala, yes, the going astray, the erring, the drifting from the straight path, as we had it in Surah Al-Fatiha. And they prefer that to the guidance. For whatever short-term advantage, ultimately it will end them up in the wrong place. So Allah says their trade will not prosper. A trade that doesn't prosper, a trade that doesn't bring growth, that doesn't bring in that benefit, is a pointless one. If they realized it, they wouldn't be doing it. And they are not going to be guided because they've sold out on that, so they're not going to get it. And then with the next ayat, we stay on that theme of limited short-term benefit that doesn't ultimately get you anywhere. Because now Allah uses an example. And metaphors are used quite a lot in the Qur'an. Examples where one thing is compared with something else, so we better understand it. Allah says elsewhere in the Qur'an, He says, this is how we coin examples for people, in order that they understand, but only those with knowledge will understand it. So of course, if Allah coins an example about something similar, you will only understand what He means by it if you have some knowledge of what He talks about. So if, for example, here He says their likeness or their example is like someone who lights a fire, then you need to know about lighting a fire and what the fire does and so on. Or later He says it's like a darkness in a cloud, then you need to know about clouds. So only if you have that knowledge will that example mean something to you, obviously. And at the same time, interestingly here as well, because Surah Al-Baqara is in a way the longest surah, but also it contains that depth of information. It contains all the relevant injunctions, prohibitions, and a lot also of basic understanding of nature, of creation. The whole story of creation is in there, the history of mankind as it were, and also the natural world, yes, the scientific statements. So it gives you a sort of first detailed encyclopedic view of the world. Now, when Allah uses examples, He simplifies for us the understanding of processes. Because processes we observe in the natural world, we understand them intuitively because we've seen it happening so many times. Whereas matters of psychology or deep human nature are more difficult to understand. So when He compares them, He makes it easy for us through those parallels. Because He says it's like that. And that we understand because we see it all the time. Of course, there is sometimes a difficulty that if these examples are basic examples that relate to standard, ordinary human life experience, but we live in a very artificial, man-made world where these experiences are no longer present, then sometimes we fail to understand those examples as well, because we've removed ourselves from those basic practices that would help us understanding. Just like there's no point talking about certain stars in the sky if you live in a town where you never see the stars in the sky, because we all have artificial lighting and means nothing to people. We do live in city environments, in a life situation where a lot of basic natural things are no longer available to children, for example, in their life experience. I mean, how many children think that meat grows on supermarket shelves, until they realize that actually an animal has to die for it and things like that. So again, you need to have knowledge of those situations to benefit from those metaphors. Now, that Allah deals in so much detail with those hypocrites means that they're also a very important category. They're more difficult to understand in many ways than just a straightforward believer or a straightforward disbeliever. And so we get more detail here. So he gives us two examples, and the first one is that of one who lights a fire, and then when it lights up what surrounds him, Allah takes their light away and leaves them in darkness, unable to see. So here is the story of somebody who does something for a purpose. The hypocrisy is not without purpose. Somebody lights a fire, why? He wants to see. You don't light a fire for the fun of it. Now that fire initially has the desired effect. It lights up what surrounds him. And actually it surrounds him rather than surrounds it. So we could say it as well, in the sense that because fire is feminine, but it says ma hawlahu, what is around, and then comes the masculine pronoun. So what is around him, the one who lights it up rather. Or we could say what is around it in the sense that the place in which the fire is, that would be masculine as well. It's a minute detail. It doesn't really make much difference in the meaning, but just for completeness. The fire does have the desired effect in that it sheds some light. So the light here is of course similar to the guidance. Initially it gets them down a path that they want to go. It shows them a way. But then as soon as that is achieved, Allah takes their light away. So He comes into it and deprives them of that benefit. He takes that guidance away, and what happens? They are now in darkness. He leaves them in darkness and they can't see. Now some of course say that relates to the hereafter, because again we are guided by our light in the hereafter. And if we can't move forward, yes, there's this imagery that only your light, which is the result of your good deeds, helps you to move forward. Otherwise you get stuck. And depending on that, we move forward towards our ultimate destination, paradise, at a different speed, or not at all. That's why then they say to each other, lend us some of your light. Yes, the disbelievers say to the believers, and the believers say, well, go back and look what you've had. Search for it. I mean, you can't pass on good deeds in the hereafter. But so good deeds translate into light, and that light is by which we travel. But whether it relates to the hereafter or to this life, the message is effectively the same. On the short term, they achieve some of that which they intend to do, But ultimately it comes to no fruition because Allah deprives them of that benefit, because they are not legitimately entitled to it. Just by hanging on with the believers doesn't entitle them to all the benefits that the believers get, because their intentions are wrong, because works are after all by intention. And so He deprives them of that benefit, ultimately leaving them with nothing. So this is the one likeness He gives them. And He says they are deaf, dumb and blind, so they cannot return. When He gets them stuck, because they've traded error for guidance, they don't get the guidance, they are now helpless. Again, also in the hereafter, they have no deeds to show for. They are now helpless. That helplessness is expressed in this deaf, dumb and blind analogy. Because how do we move around the world? We use our senses. People who are blind have usually a better hearing. People who are deaf rely more on their eyesight. If you have neither, at least you communicate with people, so you can get some advice. How far is it? Can I move? Is the road clear? Or anything like that. If you have none of that, you're stuck, deaf, dumb and blind. We're not talking here about the physical deafness or blindness or dumbness. We're talking about spiritually. They are unable to listen to the truth and do something with it. They are unable to see the truth and do something with it. They are unable to communicate in order to get the truth, to ask for it even. So totally lost, like in total darkness. In fact, if you go back to this ayat before, you find something else here. And really, it's you can't really put it all in words. You really have to just imagine that imagery. What happens if you are in a dark place and it's sort of twilight? You can hardly see. You can adapt to it, can't you? Now you put on the light, make a fire, or let's say start a torch. It lights up things. You see properly. Suddenly your battery fails. The torch is out. You see less than you did before. Yeah? It's worse than when you were first in darkness. Because you had some light and now that is taken away, leaves you totally lost and helpless. You have no more orientation. So having had the guidance and then losing it is worse than never having had the guidance in the first place. Those who encountered Islam and then played with it are worse off than those who never knew about it. Natural ignorance is a bit like in the twilight, is not quite as bad as self-inflicted ignorance through the refusal of accepting knowledge. And if you look a little bit again into this ayat, you find that it's effectively this one ayat about lighting the fire and then it disappears and then you're just lost, deaf, dumb and blind. It's a little bit like the story of Western civilization as well. Sums it up very nicely. In the so-called Dark Ages, that term isn't there for no reason, that civilization was born out of an encounter with Islamic civilization, yes, in Andalus, in Spain, through which scientific knowledge, through which exploration, understanding came, challenged the old dogma, made them prosper for a little bit, but because they only wanted it for some benefit, they took it without its foundation, they took it without the proper belief in Allah, they only wanted the fruit of it without adhering to the whole system. That fire went out very quickly and left them completely confused and in darkness. So it actually brought them up to a level of technological advancement, but at the same time left them without orientation, not knowing where they're going, where they're ending up, and in many times destroying more things than they were actually constructively building. Look at the wars that resulted from it, the destruction, the harm, the self-inflicted harm of that civilization. And it sums it up, because they start something on the false premise, then it gets taken away from them. They don't any longer have that guidance. They made a bad trade, and so they are left in the darkness, unable to see, unable to have orientation, completely disorientated, deaf, dumb and blind, don't know where they go, experimenting a bit here, experimenting a bit there, no direction. Really sums it up as well, if you look at it at kind of the wider development of human civilization. Then Allah gives us yet another likeness, another example in the following ayat, where He says, or like a rain cloud from the sky with darkness, thunder and lightning in it. Yeah? Now, of course, He's also telling us something here about the rain cloud. I mean, the cloud He's talking about here, the rain cloud, is what in clouds we know as the cumulus, yes, the cumulonimbus, the thunder cloud. That cloud that towers, you know, you can see them as big with anvils, you know, big sort of towering cloud. That's the cloud that has darkness in it, because the other clouds, they just fluffy clouds. You go in there, they're all white. Yeah, they just like fog, really. Thin water droplets. That's not the cloud He's talking about. He's talking here about the rain cloud, the thunder cloud. That is a big, solid, heavy cloud that is dark. And in it, it has not just darkness, but also thunder and lightning. Yeah? So, the cloud with the darkness has the thunder and lightning. The other clouds don't have thunder and lightning. They don't give rain either. Just so for the record, I mean, there are different types of clouds. That cloud that brings the rain also has the thunder and the lightning in it. Yeah? You will find that the other clouds aren't rain clouds. So there is a quite clear understanding here of different types of clouds. And what is the imagery of a cumulonimbus cloud? If you're inside it, you're stranded, you don't know what to do. I mean, if you fly into any other cloud, yeah, with your little aeroplane, it's all right. You don't see, but nothing happens. You get into one of those clouds, it's disaster. You don't want to be in there. There are violent updrafts, downdrafts, hail, you know, everything. It tosses you about, it messes you about. In the end, you don't know where you are anymore. If you can ride it out, it's like a heavy storm. You're lucky, but most of the time, you really lose yourself. So the image of these people is that they let themselves into something that damages them ultimately, where they can't get back out, where they don't know where is left, right, up, down. They're totally involved, thrown into it, and get sucked into it, as it were, and are deaf, dumb and blind again, because there's no way out. You don't know which way to turn or which way to go, because there's so much happening in there. Darkness, you can't see. Then there's the lightning, there's the thunder. Completely. Takes your eyesight away, takes your ears away, you know, deafens you, blinds you, leaves you speechless. In a way, it's an extension of what he said earlier. So, That is their situation. When they're in their hustle bustle of life, they got just tossed about with this, with that, and they go through life and don't know why they're doing what. At the end they look back and think, what have I done? Have nothing to show for it in the hereafter. They just get drifting, tossed about, thrown around, have no clear idea where they're going, no orientation, are blinded by this, deafened by that. And then it's so overwhelming that Allah says they put their fingers in their ears out of fear from the impact of the thunder. Now, thunder is a very loud occurrence. And it's always linked with what? With lightning. The two go together. Because effectively it's a heavy electrical discharge. I mean, we know more about these things now. When that was revealed, people didn't know about electrical discharge. You read up on the tafsir of this ayah, people still talk about the angel who sits in the cloud and, throws down the lightning bolt. He has this rod, this metal rod of fire, things like that. That's how people imagined it was going on. But we know a little bit more about that now. And of course the Qur'an, sometimes, you only understand it when you've got more knowledge and researched. So time passes and understanding changes. But what is said there is still correct. Because the description is not one of it's done like this or like that. It gives you a summary of what is quite detailed. And matches the reality, because Allah knows best. He knows what He's created. But the thunder and the lightning go together. So when people are deafened by the thunder, put their fingers in the ears. Why do people put their fingers in the ears? Because they don't want to hear something. And there is a play on words here as well, because elsewhere we told they put their fingers in the ears because they don't want to hear the guidance. They don't want to hear it in case it has an effect on them. They want to escape it. Here they want to escape the punishment. This has ideas of punishment. Just by pretending it's not there, it doesn't go away, though, does it? You put your fingers in the ears doesn't mean it's not there. But they do it out of fear. Fear from what? The effect of the thunder. What's the effect of the thunder? Well, the lightning, when it hits something, destroys it. So here is an imagery of people being lost and also being subjected to destructive forces that they cannot fight and would wish they weren't there and would want to hide from but can't. So here is the association with the hereafter again. Once they're caught like that, there is no running. It doesn't help. You can't get away. So in an ayat like this, because then Allah says, and Allah surrounds those who reject the guidance. He's all around them. If you ever been caught up in a thunderstorm, there's no point going this way, that way, or any other way, not that you even know where you'd go, because you can hardly see. A proper thunderstorm, heavy pelting rain and lightning and thunder. If you ever got caught up in one of those in the open, you can't see where you're going. If you're caught up in that, let's say, in the middle of a motorway, you hardly see the car in front of you. It's extremely dangerous, frightening. It surrounds you. It's all around. There's no point saying, well, if I can't go this way, I go the other. And like this, Allah surrounds those who disbelieve. Here now he comes back to those who reject faith, and as we started out talking about the hypocrites, we are by that describing them as kafirin as well. We understand that that's where they really belong. They may be in between, but ultimately they're on that side. They're not with the believers half and with the others half. They're actually part of that side, part of the disbelieving side. But Allah surrounds them and lets them no escape. Even so, they would want to hide, they would want to pretend it doesn't exist. It's too late. In this world they can pretend. that they are believers. In the next world they can't pretend that they are now disbelievers, that they are hung with those who get the punishment. There is no more pretense. It's too late for that. So it's a very powerful imagery. And it continues, Allah says, the lightning almost takes away their eyesight. It brings us back to the earlier description with the fire. Same thing. When you have this flash of lightning, you see a glimpse of light, you think, oh yeah, I can see, but it blinds you and leaves you even worse off because you're in more of a darkness. The lightning almost takes away their eyesight. Whenever it lights up for them, they walk with it, so you stumble along a little bit. And when it becomes dark for them, they stop. Yeah, as I said, it describes the civilization very much. They have a glimmer of, oh yeah, that might be right, so they go for it, and then they can't go further because they lost it again. So you get the image of somebody just stumbling along, not knowing where they go. They get a shimmer of light, they go for it, they lose it again. They go somewhere else and they lose it again. It's a quite powerful and vivid description of their state of mind. They run after this idea, leads nowhere. They run after that, leads nowhere. They haven't got a clear, steady path or guidance. And then Allah says, and it's almost again like mocking them, because He says He makes fun of them. If Allah wished, He would have taken away their hearing and their eyesight. Allah has power to do anything. If He wanted, He could have made them actually deaf and blind. Physically deaf and blind. But He doesn't. He gives them their senses, their capacity, but it's useless for them. It still doesn't help them. Yeah? Rather than just taking it away, so they move around like vegetables, He lets them have it. He says, but what are you going to do with it? You've got eyes, but you can't see because you get blinded by this and that flash of light, of idea, and then you're stuck again. You don't listen to the guidance. You don't do nothing with your abilities that Allah has given you. So if He wanted, He would have taken them away as well, but no, He doesn't. It's worse. If you are deaf and can't hear, that's excusable. If you can hear it because you're not deaf but you still don't hear, that's worse. If you don't have eyes to see, you're excused. If you can see everything but don't draw any conclusions from it, don't observe, don't understand, don't take it in, that's worse, that's unforgivable. So what Allah is saying here is that their condition is worse than if they were created without the ability to perceive, without the ability to take in information. As He says elsewhere in the Qur'an, they like cattle or worse than animals. Because they got the ability but don't use it. They are better. Humans are created better than other creation. But if we waste that ability and don't make any use of it, then we're worse than other creation. Because from other creation, that same level of understanding is not expected. They're not capable of it. But we are capable of it, and then not to do it is worse than not being able to. So a very, very powerful description and condemnation of this group of people. And that brings us to, as it were, the end of this particular section. That is the introduction we had of Surah al-Baqarah. That is an introduction in which He talks about people in the world in the third person. There are these people, there are those people. Amongst them is this and that is what happens. Their example is like this and like that. It's a descriptive narrative. Now we move over from there with ayah 21 to a direct address. Now Allah talks to the believers. He's told us about the others, and this book, remember, is just for the believers, for the muttaqeen, for those who are aware of Allah. This book is not for anybody else. So we are told about all the others, but when Allah now speaks, He speaks to us. But then when He does His first direct address, He nonetheless makes it inclusive to give others a chance to join the believers.
So they still have a chance.
He doesn't say the believers are those and that's it, finished, book closed. He still invites everybody, now that they've understood these are the different groups, to join the right one. It's an open invitation. So He starts not with all believers, He says, "O people." Addressed to everybody. So now we have a direct speech. Allah says, "O people," and now He tells us as people, but specifically as believers, what He wants from us. He says, "Serve your Lord who created you and those before you, so that you are aware of Him, so that you fear Him." And here we come full circle. He says, serve, worship Allah, the one who created you and those before you. Means He's the only one who created anybody. Why? Worship so that you are amongst the muttaqeen. The muttaqeen are the ones for whom this book is, as a guidance. The muttaqeen are the ones who are going to be successful. So if you don't want to be amongst the others, the ones whose hearts are sealed and for whom there is severe punishment, if you don't want to be amongst those who pretend and Allah makes fun of them because they try and make fun of Him, you don't be amongst those who are lost in the dark and can't find their way, then worship Allah, because that is the only way you're going to be amongst the right group. Now Allah doesn't tell us here how to worship Him, that comes later. But He tells us that principle, that serving Him, the word is from ibadah. I'budullah. What is an abd? An abd is a slave. The concept is that the slave does what he's told. The slave is not the same as a worker or a servant. Nowadays we don't like being slaves, we always translate it with servant. Not quite. A servant, can say, "Oh, I'm leaving this job, I'm looking for a new one. I'm looking for a new master." A slave, he's owned by his master. He has no choice. There is no other master he can go to without the master's permission. Whether he likes it or not, he has to. But He says, do it willingly. It's like Allah says to the earth and the heavens, come willingly or unwillingly. They say, we come willingly. But it's the willingness is what Allah wants from us, but we don't have a choice. This is what we've been made for. This is what Allah created us for, and He created us. We are His property. We and our deeds are His property. So that worship, that serving, is quite clear about that it is not an option. It's the only way. It's our essence, our being. It's a must. It's our nature to do that. And only if we do that are we going to be amongst the ones who are aware of Allah. So how do we create awareness of Allah? By worship. Now there are different acts of worship, but let's take prayer for example. By regularly praying, you keep reminding yourself of the presence of Allah, and the presence of Allah, this remembrance, the dhikr, is what then helps you always to reflect and think, should I do this, should I do that? Is that what Allah wants? Is that what Allah doesn't want? And so you take the right decisions because you remember and you do exactly what He wants you to do. That is what makes you aware of Him, the worship. Once you commit yourself to work for Him, you're not going to forget about Him. The servant, the slave, if he's in the service of his master, he doesn't do one job and then he goes wandering off. He knows that he's got to be there for the next job. He doesn't forget about his master. by being in His service, he remembers that he must always try to please the Master. That is our relationship to Allah. And he made it clear why this is our relationship to Him, because we owe Him our existence. It's not that He bought us on a slave market. Yeah? He created us. We wouldn't be there without Him. So obviously we must serve Him and nobody else. But with this ayat, we've basically come full circle. It started as being a guidance for those who fear Allah, and then He told us about all these other people. And then He tells us, if you want to be amongst those, this is how you do it. Serve Allah. And again, just briefly, created you and those before you. Again, there are speculations whether this is just the earlier generations or whether there was a different kind of creation before us, let's say on this earth. Because the same comes when we come to the term Khalifa. Are they just the generations, or do we replace some other creation that was there before us, and so on and so forth. But I don't want to go into that right now, but just as a note. It could mean a number of things. But He has always created everything, so whatever there was created by Him, including us. And then, and I think I'll close with that ayat for today, He gives us a little bit more a justification why we must serve Him in a way. When He says, He who made the earth spread out for you and the sky a cover, and sent water down from the sky, with which He makes fruit grow from the earth as provision for you, so do not knowingly set up partners for Allah. Again, this ayat has a wealth of information in it. But the basic function is that it takes this notion of why we owe Him our allegiance and service a little bit further, in that He says, not just did He create you and then abandon you, He also made everything proper for you to live. He arranged everything around you for your benefit. But if you look at it in a little bit more detail, because then again we go further into something else. We then, after that, Allah puts out the challenge to those who don't want to follow this invitation. But let's just deal with this ayat, and then we come to that in the next occasion. When Allah says that He spread the earth out for us, firash is the sort of thing that you recline on. It's like a mattress, or it's comfortable. What He reminds us of is that He made this earth livable. He could have made it like a moonscape. Some very rugged mountainous terrain, maybe with lots of crevices. You walk a meter and you fall down. You can't get anywhere. And whilst there are, just to remind us how it could be, certain little places in the earth that are just like that,
Very similar.
predominantly the earth is actually livable. You can walk on it, you can move on it, you can build roads on it. It is spread out, it is comfortable. It's not hostile in that sense. So that's the first blessing He mentions. He doesn't just say He's given you the earth. He also basically says He's given you an earth that is easy to live on, in comparison of how it could be. And of course, again, I don't want to go into this right now, because there are other ayats that deal with that even more, but the very fact that the earth is livable is a miracle in itself. The way it's positioned, the way it's tilted, the way it has the right gravitational pull to have the atmosphere, and so on and so forth. Now, He mentions the sky as a cover, as a canopy, Yeah? And that is again an interesting concept. I just mentioned the atmosphere, and that is expressed in there. Because ultimately the sky, of course, as we know, is not a sort of a little roof on the earth. It's a deep, vast, endless universe. There are 7 heavens, 7 dimensions, and the sky is the lowest heaven. Because he says he ornamented the lowest heaven with stars. So the ones we see, our universe is the lowest heaven. There are dimensions beyond that. But that one, which is really hostile when you get out there, but from the perspective of the earth, he's made it as a cover. What does a cover do? It shields us. Yeah? A cover shields, protects, shades you. And that is exactly what our atmosphere does for us. If there wasn't an atmosphere, we couldn't live here. Again, just like if the earth wasn't spread out, we couldn't live on it. We couldn't live on it if there wasn't an atmosphere. The sun would kill us. Various little bits of space stuff, meteors or what, would bombard us all the time. But because we've got this protective cover around the earth, these things don't get through. They get deflected or eaten up before they reach us. So he's protected us in space. And as I said, to do that is not an easy thing. I mean, anybody who studies astronomy or anything of those fields will understand that it's a very fine, precarious balance. If the earth was tilted just a little bit more, or the speed of the rotation would change just by fractions of a second, the whole thing would finish. There isn't in the universe we know, we've explored, any other planet that has this available climate to live in. It's unique, and Allah has done that for us. And people search the space because they think if we destroy the earth we go somewhere else, but it's a bit tricky, you know, because there is nowhere else that is just like that. And obviously not successfully, but then comes the key. So this ayat really, I mean, as I said, has a lot in it, because now he says he sent water down from the sky. Now, we're now getting into the water cycle. There wouldn't be life on earth even if it's nice and flat without the water. Allah says elsewhere he created everything living from water. There wouldn't be life without water at all. Now he sends the water from the sky. We've had the rain cloud earlier, and we're talking about that many times, but sending the water from the sky is an understanding of what the atmosphere does. Because the water comes down, because the water that is on the earth evaporates through the heat, rises through the atmosphere, condenses, and then descends again. Without that, and elsewhere in this ayat it isn't in there, the wind comes into it as well. Because the wind moves the clouds then. Because with the heat differential we get weather. Yes, it causes air flows and we get the weather. And of course without an atmosphere you wouldn't have weather. And if that sky wasn't the cover, there would be no possibility for a water cycle. So we get that weather phenomenon because the earth or water or whatever heats up at different speeds, different temperatures, and then Of course it intermixes and so on, but basically we now have that essential ingredient, the water, which, because of the presence of an atmosphere, goes back on the earth. If the earth had no gravity to hold it in, once the oceans evaporated, that's it.
Nothing will be coming back.
Even if there was water in the first place, yeah? There wouldn't be much of it left. But that's not what happens. Because the earth is balanced in that way, with the right gravitational pull, sufficient distance from the sun, not too close, not too far, it can hold that water that evaporates and bring it back down. And when it comes back down, it falls on the land, not just on the ocean. And it falls as drinkable water. Because in the ocean it's not. It's salty. So he says, he makes fruit grow from the earth as provision for you with that water. So the water now is, of course, the ingredient to create growth. And of course, fruit is not the only thing that grows, but it's the ultimate benefit of growth. Of course, first the tree grows before it grows fruit. There is greens and all kinds of things that grow, and mentioned elsewhere in the Qur'an, but here we really just have a summary. And ultimately, the growth that is produced by the water provides us with the benefit of having fruit. And that fruit is our nourishment so we can live. Okay, we don't just live only on fruit. There are other things we eat. But even then, if we eat a chicken, the chicken first has to eat something. The cow has to eat something. So it's still the same. I mean, all the animals that we eat initially feed on plants.
It's all to do with the water coming down.
And it's the water that grows the plants. And of course, amongst the plants, yeah, we could just live on grass. But the fruit is the ultimate, and that's why also we have this imagery of fruit in paradise, because it's not just food, you know, that helps you survive, but it's also pleasurable. It looks good.
Tasty.
It tastes good.
Tastes and all sorts of things.
Yeah? And also, and I think an important point, he makes fruit grow for us. There's a purpose. So the fruit doesn't grow just as a protection for the seed, like the sort of, you know, Darwinist folks would want you to believe that the tree surrounds its seeds for protection with fruit. There's no need to have all this tasty, good-looking fruit just for protecting the seed, or just so the animals want to eat it and spread the seed. It's grown for us because when you look at a tree, the economics of the tree totally violate Darwinist theory of survival of the fittest, that everything has to be economy, nothing wasted. Yeah? It's rubbish. That tree will have much more fruit than it ever needs to grow another tree. Look at the trees, how heavy they're laden with fruit. The abundance there. I mean, if this was about natural selection and all that nonsense, then each tree would just have exactly enough fruit to survive. It wouldn't waste its energy on all the rest.
And we would starve.
We would starve, yeah. Quite right. So there is a purpose far beyond just the survival of a particular plant species. Allah reminds us of the blessings So we don't just serve him because he demands so, but also because we have a lot to thank him for. He is not a cruel master, he is a benign, beneficent master. He's not somebody you serve because you have to, but because you want to. Because he's made it so great for you. He's made really, you are his slave, but he lets you live like a king. On a comfortable earth, protected and shielded nicely with the sky, water there, fruit growing. What more do you want? Everything's there for you. And fruit is amazing when you look at how many varieties there are, how many different types, the most strange things you come across if you travel into different countries. You never thought they exist. And it's all there, so we don't even get bored, because if we ate the same old pills every day, you know, like when they go in their space shuttles, they complain, you know, about this sort of minimalist diet that keeps you alive but really boring. No, Allah makes it interesting for us. He makes it enjoyable for us. So serving Allah is not a, you know, dull thing, horrible, do I have to? Serving Allah is actually an enjoyable experience. So he reminds us that that's what he's done. He's created us, those before us. He made the earth livable. He made the sky cover. He provides us with water, with fruit, as a provision for us. He says, so do not knowingly set up partners for Allah. Don't ascribe any of these blessings to anybody else. He's done all that. Serve him, and don't try and pretend somebody else did it. At least don't do so knowingly. It's only what you know that you are accountable for. You're not accountable for things you do unawares. Yeah? So for example, we're not accountable for what happens in our sleep. We don't get punished for our dreams. Yeah? If you dreamt that you were, you know, talking to some idol or something, you don't get punished for that. It's not what you knowingly do. Yeah? So this idea comes now into the clear monotheism, the oneness of Allah. There are no partners. That's the key here. You serve Allah, but you serve only Him. Of course we had that in Surah Fatiha already again. Everything's there in Surah Fatiha, really condensed. But we're getting into it now. We're getting into the topic. Allah does not tolerate, after doing all that, that you say, but it wasn't him. I got it from some... I did it myself, yeah, for example. Or, you know, like people want to take ownership for it. This fruit is brought to you by such and such company. Yeah? Well, no, they didn't. All they did is pick it and sell it. Or they start patenting the seeds for some plants and say, well, we created this particular, you know, that's all things that Allah doesn't like that. That's what they're doing, isn't it? Making themselves creators, or like in other religions, you know, where they've deteriorated from the pure religion, they start saying, oh, that thunder, he's a powerful guy. And the lightning must appease the lightning, you know, must sacrifice. And the mountain god and the trees, and, you know, and start praying to the trees, give us good fruit this year, or things like that.
Start worshipping the creation.
Yeah, because Allah's made it very clear He's done all that. And He's done all that for our benefit. Please be happy with it, take it, make use of it, but don't turn to anybody else to thank for it. Acknowledge at least what He's done. That's all He's asking for, is acknowledge it. Serve Him. Don't put your life at the disposal of somebody else who's not done anything for you, who's himself created. So that's the key message. And then, but I'll stop here for now. We move over to the challenge to those who don't want to follow that path. So here Allah's given us the different people, and as He's given us the different people, He says you should be amongst those, and this is what you do to be amongst those, and it makes sense as well because that's what He's done. But then He comes and says, well, and if you don't do that, well then there are other things. Then this is the consequence, and so on. And so in the next number of ayats that follow here, Allah, just like He addressed people about what they should do, challenges them if they don't, and says, well then if you don't do that, then there's this and there's that. And when that is dealt with, He then moves to yet another section and tells us in detail the whole story of our creation. So then we get the first of the history, creation of Adam and so on. And with the creation of Adam, we understand the purpose of our existence, of our life. We get introduced to the other elements of creation besides us, because there are the angels, there are the jinn. So as you can see from starting, it then widens, and opens up, and you go deeper and deeper into it, and you move then on into history on earth, what happened after the expulsion from paradise, and then you go further on and Allah deals with the children of Israel. So we get into the more recent history that precedes this revelation, and in the process we get the examples of other prophets and so on, and how they dealt with their people, and it's all examples for us to learn how to deal or not to deal with situations. And then Allah in detail gives us, as it were, a sort of do's and don'ts in Surah al-Baqara, from instructions about marriage and divorce, about fasting, about jihad, about economics, the prohibition of interest. So we get inheritance, we get into a lot of detail afterwards, and that is what Surah al-Baqarah is particularly known for. And it's a surah that is predominantly placed in Medina, because in the ayats, because that was the time when all these detailed rules were established, because Islam had its own entity, its own society. So we've kind of passed this introduction, and this introduction is a very powerful introduction. And then it gets opened up. But as we deal with these things that come over the next sessions, and we may be talking about laws of inheritance or whatever, it's important that each time we deal with that, we keep it in context with that whole framework. We don't forget that this is the purpose of the Qur'an. This is the scene setting of the Qur'an. This is the framework in which it operates. These are the parameters that everything relates to. So when Allah tells us you must distribute inheritance like this or like that, or you must do your economic dealings like this or like that, or this is how fasting is done, He tells us because that is part of what you do if you serve Him. And if you don't do it, then you deviate from the path, and then you get to some other group that you don't want to be in. And you can't pick and choose. You have to take the whole thing. Otherwise you just stumble a bit with a bit of lightning and you get stuck again. and you can't share that with any other concept. It's exclusive. Allah has no partners, because otherwise you're ungrateful, and after all He made everything for you. So that is the concept that we have to bear in mind, when we want to understand the rest of the Qur'an, the details that we find particularly in Surah al-Baqara as we go through it. It's easy to get caught up just in the odd ayat about this or about that, and then maybe even dispute about the minute detail, as people do. And that is not what is intended. These details, these rules, these regulations aren't given to us so that we disagree about them, fight about them, kill each other about them. These are given to us as a more step-by-step guidance, but always in view of the greater picture of our journey to the hereafter, of our attempt to serve Allah in order to be amongst those who are aware and who are successful. That is important, and that's why the introduction is so clear, to not make us forget that. And that's where we carry on next time, inshallah.